Picture yourself standing at the edge of a damp, pitch-black pit, the air thick with the scent of decay and the distant echoes of muffled screams. This wasn't just any prison. It was a place so cruel, so calculated in its torment, that even the bravest knights would sooner face 100 enemies on the battlefield than endure a single night within its walls. Welcome to the shadowy world of medieval prisons, where justice was often a mask for pure terror. These weren't mere holding cells. They were labyrinths of despair, designed to crush hope as thoroughly as bones. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 28 of history's most feared dungeons, places where the very architecture seemed to whisper of suffering. What made these prisons worse than war? Battlefields offered chaos, yes, but also the slim chance of glory or a quick end. Medieval dungeons, on the other hand, were slow, deliberate, and utterly relentless. They weren't just about punishment, they were about domination. Think of the Oubliette, a hole so deep and narrow that prisoners were left to rot in darkness, their names literally forgotten. Or the towering fortresses where captives dangled in iron cages, exposed to the elements and the mocking stares of passers-by. These places weren't built to rehabilitate. They were built to erase. But why did these structures exist in such grotesque variety? The answer lies in the medieval mindset. Fear was a tool, and pain was a language everyone understood. From the whispering galleries of Château to the bone-chilling cold of the bottled dungeon in Scotland, each prison had its own unique way of breaking the human spirit. And that's what we're about to explore: the stories behind these nightmares, the methods that made them infamous, and the shocking reasons they were often considered deadlier than any battlefield. So steel yourself, because we're about to step into the darkness where history's most terrifying prisons waited, and few who entered ever left unchanged. Imagine being lowered into a hole barely wider than your shoulders, the rough stone scraping against your skin as the last flicker of light vanishes above you. The Oubliette wasn't just a prison, it was a vertical grave, a place where time stretched into an endless nightmare. Unlike dungeon cells where prisoners might at least hear the distant shuffle of guards or the cries of others, the Oubliette sealed its victims in perfect isolation. The air grew thick with the stench of stagnant water and decay, the only sounds the occasional drip of moisture or the scuttling of rats. Many who were thrown inside weren't even criminals in the traditional sense. Some were political rivals, inconvenient witnesses, or simply those who had angered the wrong noble, their fate to be erased quite literally from memory. What made the Oubliette especially cruel was its deliberate design. Unlike other medieval punishments meant to make a public spectacle of suffering, this was hidden horror, out of sight, out of mind. The pit's narrow walls prevented sitting or lying down comfortably, forcing prisoners into a perpetual crouch until their muscles cramped beyond use. Food, if it came at all, was tossed down sporadically, often just enough to prolong the agony, and in the worst cases, those spikes at the bottom weren't just for show. They turned the Oubliette into a slow-motion execution chamber, where a slip in the darkness could mean days of bleeding out in the pitch black. But perhaps the most chilling detail was the psychological torment. Without daylight or human contact, minds unraveled rapidly. Prisoners reported hallucinations, their own whispers echoing back as phantom voices. Some scratched desperate pleas into the walls, their fingernails worn to the quick. Others simply curled into the fetal position and waited for death. The Oubliette wasn't just a test of physical endurance, it was a weapon against sanity itself. And that's why it stands as one of history's most horrifying inventions. not because it killed quickly, but because it made the act of dying feel like an eternity. The Iron Maiden stands as one of history's most chilling enigmas, a sinister fusion of artistry and agony. That iconic iron coffin, its interior bristling with strategically placed spikes, looks like something ripped straight from a nightmare. When the heavy doors swung shut, the victim would be pierced from every angle, yet not deeply enough to kill instantly. Instead, they'd linger in excruciating pain, their screams muffled by the metal tomb. But here's where history gets murky. While museums display these grotesque devices, many scholars insist they're elaborate fakes crafted centuries later to shock and titillate tourists. Yet the truth might lie somewhere in between. Medieval court records mention spiked closets, used to terrify prisoners into confession, and early engravings depict similar contraptions. The city of Nuremberg supposedly housed one as early as 1515, though no physical evidence survives. What's undeniable is how perfectly the Iron Maiden embodies medieval justice's theatrical cruelty. Even if some were later fabrications, their design mirrored real psychological torture tactics. Imagine the psychological torment of simply seeing such a device in a dungeon's shadows. The mere threat often proved more effective than its actual use. What makes the Iron Maiden legend so persistent isn't just its brutality, but its symbolism. Unlike dark pits or cramped cells, this was pain engineered with macabre precision. Each spike could be adjusted to prolong suffering, and some accounts describe victims being slowly pressed inward over hours. Whether real or not, its legacy reveals a dark truth about medieval punishment. Fear thrived on spectacle. The Iron Maiden wasn't just a tool, it was theater, a physical manifestation of power that whispered a warning to all who dared defy authority. And that may be why, centuries later, it still haunts our imagination. Rising from the churning waves off Marseille's coast, Château wasn't just a prison, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The fortress's very location, a jagged island surrounded by treacherous currents, sent an unmistakable message. Once you entered, there would be no exit. Unlike castles built to repel invaders, this structure was designed to keep people in, with triple thick walls and labyrinthine corridors that echoed with the despair of those forgotten inside. While its fictional portrayal in The Count of Monte Cristo romanticized daring escapes, reality was far grimmer. Most prisoners never saw the sky again, their lives reduced to the muffled sounds of the sea crashing against stone. The cells themselves were studies in slow suffocation. Cut off from sunlight and fresh air, inmates breathed in the dampness of salt water and mildew, their clothes rotting on their bodies. Political dissidents, religious reformers, even unlucky merchants who'd crossed the wrong official, all were dumped into this watery purgatory, but none captured the public imagination like the man in the iron mask. Locked away under orders of absolute secrecy, his face hidden behind that eerie metal visor, his identity became Europe's most tantalizing unsolved mystery. Was he a disgraced aristocrat, a bastard son of royalty, or perhaps a failed assassin who knew too much? The truth vanished into the same silence that swallowed his whispers. What made Château uniquely cruel wasn't just its isolation, but its symbolism. Unlike dank underground dungeons, prisoners here could glimpse the bustling port of Marseille through narrow windows, a cruel reminder of the life just out of reach. Disease spread like wildfire in the cramped quarters, with typhoid and dysentery claiming more lives than executioners ever did. And yet, the prison's reputation as an inescapable hell might have been its greatest weapon. The mere threat of being sent there could break a man's spirit before he ever set foot on the island. In the end, Château d'If wasn't just walls and chains, it was the embodiment of hopelessness, a place where time didn't pass. It stood still. Deep beneath the ruins of St. Andrew's Castle in Scotland lies a nightmare carved from stone, the Bottle Dungeon. Unlike the Oubliette's vertical drop or the Iron Maiden's theatrical spikes, this prison was a masterstroke of silent cruelty. Picture a flask-shaped pit, its narrow neck opening to a bulbous chamber below, designed so no sound could escape. Once the trapdoor above slammed shut, prisoners plunged into a darkness so complete it swallowed even time itself. What made this dungeon uniquely terrifying wasn't just its shape, but its location. Dug directly into the castle's foundations, the walls wept with icy condensation, the air so thick with brine that skin peeled like parchment. Survivors, though few ever emerged, described the horror of its acoustics. Every gasp or whimper echoed endlessly, bouncing off the curved walls until prisoners couldn't distinguish their own cries from the phantom echoes of those who'd suffered before them. Some went mad within days, clawing at the slick stone in futile attempts to scale the bottle's neck. Others succumbed to the cold, their bodies found curled like fetuses in the perpetual damp. But the dungeon's true ingenuity was its dual purpose. During sieges, it doubled as a water reservoir, meaning prisoners might find themselves knee-deep in frigid runoff, their legs numbing as the tide of their own waste rose around them. Yet the Bottle Dungeon's most chilling feature was its democracy. Bishops and beggars alike rotted within its walls. In 1546, Protestant preacher George Wishart endured its depths before being burned at the stake, his final sermons whispered into the indifferent stone. The dungeon didn't discriminate, it broke nobles and peasants with equal efficiency, and that's what made it such a potent symbol of power. No screams could escape. No light could penetrate. Just a silent, glistening tomb where the only escape was death's slow embrace. Hidden beneath the cobbled streets of St. Andrew's, the Bottle Dungeon wasn't just a prison, it was a masterpiece of psychological torment disguised as architecture. That distinctive flask shape wasn't an accident, it was calculated cruelty. The narrow neck ensured no prisoner could brace themselves to climb out, while the bulbous chamber below amplified every sound into a disorienting echo. Imagine the horror of being lowered into that abyss, the rope creaking above you as the last sliver of light vanished. The moment your feet touched the slimy floor, you realized the truth. This wasn't a cell. It was a living grave. What made the Bottle Dungeon uniquely sinister was its environment. Unlike dank pits that at least had stagnant air, this space was hermetically sealed. Moisture seeped through the porous stone, creating a clammy chill that clung to the skin. Prisoners inhaled the reek of their own waste, the stagnant air growing thicker with every labored breath. And then there were the acoustics. Whispers morphed into ghostly wails, driving many to madness long before starvation took them. Some scratched prayers into the walls, their fingers bleeding against the unyielding rock. Others simply curled into the fetal position and waited for the end, their minds unraveling in the endless dark. But the dungeon's true horror lay in its purpose. During Scotland's religious wars, it became a weapon against dissent. Protestant reformers like George Wishart knew its embrace well. Their crimes, nothing more than defiance of Catholic doctrine. The Bottle Dungeon didn't just punish the body, it erased voices. No screams reached the streets above, no last words inspired fellow rebels, just silence. And in that silence, the powerful sent a message. Defiance would be swallowed whole, leaving no trace behind. That's why this stone flask endures as one of history's most chilling symbols. Not for its spikes or chains, but for its efficiency in making people disappear without a sound. Newgate prison wasn't just a jail, it was a living, breathing monument to human suffering, a place where the very air carried the stench of despair. For over 7 centuries, its foul corridors echoed with the sounds of rattling chains and desperate pleas, earning a reputation so grim that even London's most violent criminals trembled at its mention. Unlike the isolated terror of the Oubliette or the calculated cruelty of the bottled dungeon, Newgate thrived on chaos. Picture a single cell built for 20 crammed with 100 souls, bodies pressed together like cargo in a ship's hold, the floor slick with filth and the weak trampled underfoot. The prison's most infamous horror was the press room, a chamber where justice took the form of pure, grinding weight. Those who refused to plead, whether out of defiance or innocence, were laid beneath wooden boards, then slowly loaded with iron weights until ribs cracked and breath became impossible. Some held out for hours, their bodies flattening like parchment under the relentless pressure. Others succumbed quickly, their final gasps lost in the jeers of spectators. This wasn't just punishment, it was theater, a brutal lesson in the consequences of resisting the Crown's will. But Newgate's true signature was its relentless degradation. With no sanitation, disease festered in every corner. Typhus, known as jail fever, killed more prisoners than the executioner's noose, spreading so rapidly that even judges and jurors sometimes collapsed dead after trials. Food, when it came, was a cruel joke: moldy bread or rancid meat tossed into the cells, sparking riots among starving inmates. And above it all loomed the gallows, where hangings became public holidays. Crowds cheered as condemned men and women made their final walk to Tyburn Tree, some so weakened by their imprisonment they had to be carried to the noose. What made Newgate unique wasn't just its brutality, but its endurance. While other prisons were shadows in the medieval world, this hellhole spanned ages, evolving from a Norman-era stronghold to a Victorian nightmare. Its walls absorbed the screams of generations, from petty thieves to political rebels, and in that longevity lay its darkest power. Newgate wasn't an exception. It was a mirror reflecting how easily society's pillars, order, justice, security, could crumble into savagery when humanity was stripped away. The prison finally fell, but its legacy lingers, a reminder that the worst cages aren't always made of iron and stone. They are built from indifference. Venice might conjure images of gondolas and glittering canals, but beneath its romantic facade lurked a horror few dared to whisper about: the Posse. These wells of Venice's Doge's palace were anything but sources of life. Instead, they were dank, lightless holes where prisoners languished in water up to their knees, the brackish floodwaters of the lagoon seeping through the stones with each high tide. Unlike the dry torment of the Oubliette or the echoing dread of the bottled dungeon, the Posse weaponized Venice's own landscape against its victims. The cells sat just above sea level, meaning every ripple of the Adriatic could turn the floor into a frigid pool, rats swimming between prisoners' legs as they shivered in the perpetual damp. What made the Posse especially sinister was their location. These weren't hidden dungeons on some remote island. They lay directly beneath the palace's gilded halls, where doges held court and justice was dispensed with a flourish. The contrast couldn't have been crueler. Above, the air smelled of incense and wealth. Below, it reeked of mildew and despair. Prisoners could sometimes hear the muffled chatter of officials or the clink of fine glassware during banquets, a torturous reminder of the world that had discarded them. And escape impossible. The labyrinthine corridors of the palace, designed to confuse invaders, became an inescapable maze for anyone trying to flee upward. But the real masterpiece of torment was the Posse's sister prison above it, the Piombi. While the Piombi's lead-lined roof baked prisoners like bread in an oven during summer, the Posse offered the opposite hell, a bone-numbing cold that seeped into joints and lungs. Many inmates cycled between both, their bodies subjected to extremes that left them broken long before their trials. The most famous victim, Casanova, barely survived his stint in the Piombi, but even he admitted the Posse was where hope went to drown. The genius and horror of the Posse lay in its simplicity. Venice didn't need spikes or racks. It had the sea itself, patient and relentless, to wear down the defiant. By the time prisoners were hauled before judges, their resolve had often dissolved like salt in water, and that was the point. The Posse didn't just punish. It molded its victims into pliant shadows, their spirits as eroded as the stones that held them. In a city built on water, even justice flowed with a merciless tide. The waters of Venice's canals may shimmer under the sun, but beneath the Doge's palace they became an instrument of torture. The Posse, ironically named wells for their life-giving namesake, were anything but. These cells lay so close to the lagoon that high tides transformed them into swimming pools of misery. Prisoners would wake to the sound of water sloshing against stone, their ankles already submerged, the cold creeping upward like an unwelcome tide. Within hours, the brackish flood would rise to their knees, then their waists, carrying with it the filth of the city above. Rats, driven from their nests by the rising water, would scramble over prisoners' feet, their sharp claws adding to the torment. Survival here wasn't just about enduring hunger or isolation. It was a battle against the very environment. The constant damp rotted clothing and skin alike, leaving sores that refused to heal. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and human waste, a foul cocktail that clung to the back of the throat. And then there was the darkness, not the mere absence of light, but a suffocating blackness so complete it fooled the mind into seeing phantom shapes. Many prisoners lost their grip on reality, their whispers dissolving into incoherent ramblings as the endless drip of water became the only marker of time. Yet the Posse's cruelty was also psychological. Unlike remote dungeons, these cells sat directly below the palace's grand halls, where masked nobles danced and decisions of state were made. The contrast was excruciating. Just a few feet above, the world continued in all its opulence, while below, the forgotten withered away. Some claimed they could hear laughter or the clink of glasses during banquets, a cruel reminder of the life they'd lost. Escape seemed almost tauntingly possible. Venice's waterways were right there, just beyond the stone, but the labyrinthine corridors and vigilant guards made it a fool's dream. That's what made Casanova's escape so legendary. His daring flight from the Piombi, the lead-roofed attic prison above the Posse, became the stuff of myth. But even he, with all his charm and cunning, never dared attempt a breakout from the wells themselves. The few who tried were dragged back, their punishment doubled, their hope extinguished. The Posse didn't just break bodies, it drowned spirits, and in a city built on water, perhaps that was the point. The state's power wasn't just in its laws or its wealth, but in its ability to turn the very beauty of Venice into a weapon against those who defied it. The Tower of London might be postcard perfect today, with its iconic white towers and ravens strutting across manicured lawns, but beneath that tourist-friendly veneer lies a history steeped in calculated cruelty. This wasn't just a castle, it was a machine of psychological and physical torment, where even kings and queens weren't safe from its grasp. Take the infamous Little Ease, a cell so ingeniously sadistic it defied basic human needs. 4 walls barely wider than a man's shoulders, a ceiling too low to stand, a floor too short to lie down. Prisoners were left in a permanent crouch, their muscles screaming for relief that never came. Days blurred into weeks as the body's joints stiffened into agony, the mind unraveling from sensory deprivation. No light, no sound, just the relentless pressure of stone against flesh, a slow erasure of sanity. But the tower's horrors didn't stop at confinement. The rack awaited those deemed in need of persuasion. a wooden frame where limbs were systematically pulled apart, tendons snapping like overstrung bowstrings. The genius, if you could call it that, was in the mechanism's precision. Executioners could adjust the tension, pausing between turns of the wheel to let pain saturate the prisoner's consciousness. Some confessed to crimes they didn't commit after minutes. Others held out until their shoulders dislocated with a wet pop, their defiance rewarded with permanent disability. The tower didn't just punish, it dismantled. And then there were the high-profile prisoners, their fates a macabre spectacle. Anne Boleyn's execution was a masterclass in humiliation, a queen beheaded not by the common axe but by a swordsman imported from France, her final moments staged as theatre for the crowd. Even in death, the tower's cruelty had layers. Lesser prisoners faced the opposite problem, obscurity. Forgotten in cramped cells, they wasted away while the world moved on, their names scratched into walls like whispers in the dark. What set the tower apart wasn't just its brutality, but its duality. By day, it functioned as a royal palace, a treasury, even a zoo. By night, it became something far darker. The same halls that hosted banquets echoed with the groans of the tortured. The crown's power wasn't just displayed in jewels and ceremonies, it was etched into the shuddering breaths of those who dared oppose it. The tower's genius lay in its ability to be both symbol and slaughterhouse, a place where history was written in blood and bone, and that's why it endures in our imagination. Not just as a monument, but as a warning. Few prisons in history carry a name as chillingly literal as the Black Hole of Calcutta. This wasn't some ancient relic of the medieval world. It was a cramped, airless military lockup that turned into one of the deadliest prison disasters ever recorded. Picture a sweltering cell meant for 2, maybe 3 people, crammed with 146 souls as the Indian summer sun baked its thick brick walls into an oven. The year was 1756, and these weren't criminals, they were British East India Company soldiers and civilians, captured after the Nawab of Bengal seized Fort William. What followed wasn't just cruelty, it was a slow, suffocating nightmare that redefined human suffering. The cell measured just 14 by 18 feet, its only openings 2 small barred windows choked with dust and humidity. As the door slammed shut, bodies pressed together like cargo, skin slick with sweat in the 100-plus-degree heat. The first hour brought discomfort. The second brought desperation. By midnight, the air grew thick with the reek of vomit and frantic gasps as oxygen dwindled. People clawed at the walls, their fingernails breaking against the brick. Others collapsed, trampled underfoot in the panic. Those who survived later described drinking their own sweat to stave off dehydration, or tearing at their clothing as delirium set in. When dawn finally broke, only 23 staggered out alive. The rest had suffocated, their bodies fused together in a grim mosaic of agony. What made the black hole unique wasn't just its body count, it was the sheer indifference behind it. The Nawab's men hadn't designed this as torture. They simply didn't care. To them, it was a storage room repurposed, a trivial holding pen. Yet that casual disregard became its own kind of horror. Unlike medieval dungeons engineered for pain, this was suffering born from thoughtlessness, a reminder that the deadliest prisons aren't always built with malice. Sometimes they're just corners of the world where humanity vanishes. The legacy of the black hole lingers not because of spikes or chains, but because of its terrifying normalcy. Any room can become a tomb if enough people are forgotten inside. And in that truth lies a warning far older than the medieval world. The worst prisons aren't made of stone. They're made of apathy. Few events in prison history capture the sheer horror of neglect like the Black Hole of Calcutta. While technically just beyond the medieval period, this atrocity proved how little had changed in centuries when it came to humans suffering behind bars. The numbers alone are staggering: 146 people forced into a space no larger than a modest bedroom, with only 23 stumbling out alive by morning. But to understand the true depth of this tragedy, we need to step beyond the statistics and into that sweltering Calcutta night. Imagine the weight of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, the air so thick with sweat and breath that every gasp felt like drowning. The cell's two tiny windows, barely wider than a man's hand, might as well have been bricked shut for all the relief they offered. As temperatures soared past 100 degrees, the heat became its own kind of executioner. Clothing stuck to skin like a second layer, while the weaker prisoners collapsed, only to be crushed under the shifting tide of desperate movement. Some accounts describe men drinking their own urine to stave off dehydration, others clawing at the walls until their fingers bled, searching for cracks that didn't exist. The noise must have been unbearable: half-mad screams, prayers, the wet thud of bodies hitting the floor. What makes the black hole uniquely haunting isn't just the scale of death, but the chilling indifference behind it. Unlike medieval torture devices designed to inflict pain with precision, this was suffering born from sheer disregard. The Nawab's soldiers didn't engineer this outcome, they simply didn't care enough to prevent it. The room wasn't built as a torture chamber, it was a storage space repurposed with a shrug. That casual cruelty reveals a truth darker than any dungeon. Sometimes the most lethal prisons aren't built with malice, but with thoughtlessness. Yet the black hole's legacy lingers for another reason: it shattered the myth of progress. By the mid-18th century, Europe saw itself as advancing beyond medieval barbarism. But here was proof that humanity could still descend into savagery when power went unchecked. The survivors' testimonies sparked outrage, but they also forced an uncomfortable question: how different were these colonial horrors from the oubliettes and iron cages of the past? The answer, written in the heat-stroked bodies of those who perished, was clear. Progress hadn't abolished cruelty, it had just given it new walls to hide behind. Doran's prison wasn't just a cell, it was a grotesque experiment in breaking the human spirit through sheer physics. Imagine a vertical shaft barely wider than a man's shoulders, its smooth stone walls offering no handholds, no ledges, not even enough space to bend your knees. Prisoners were lowered into this abyss and left standing in perfect darkness, their bodies trapped in an endless present, no room to sit, no space to lie down. Just the relentless pressure of gravity, minute after hour after day, as muscles trembled and joints locked. The genius of Doran's cruelty lay in its simplicity. Unlike the Iron Maiden spikes or the rack's elaborate mechanics, this was torture stripped to its bare essentials, the human body's inability to defy time itself. Survivors, though few ever emerged, described the hallucinations first. The mind, deprived of light, sound, and movement, would conjure phantom whispers or visions of distant light. Then came the physical collapse, legs buckled under the strain, but with no room to fall, prisoners slumped against the walls, their weight borne by crushed ribs or twisted spines. The lucky ones passed out quickly. The less fortunate remained conscious as their organs failed, their final breaths mingling with the stench of those who'd already succumbed. And here's where Doran's crossed from cruelty into calculated horror. The dead weren't removed. Fresh prisoners were lowered directly onto the rotting corpses below, forced to stand atop the remains of the last victim until they too joined the gruesome foundation. What made this prison uniquely terrifying wasn't just the suffering, it was the symbolism. The shaft's vertical design mirrored a grave, reinforcing the state's message: those inside were already dead to the world. No trials, no sentences, just disappearance. Unlike the Tower of London's public executions or Venice's Posse with their proximity to power, Doran's was silence incarnate. Families received no word, guards asked no questions. Even the prison's location was rumor rather than fact, its very existence designed to be doubted. Yet perhaps the most chilling detail was its legacy. While medieval dungeons often reflected the chaos of their eras, Doran's felt eerily modern, a blueprint for psychological warfare. Centuries later, regimes would use sensory deprivation and solitary confinement to similar effect. The prison's true innovation wasn't its structure, but its understanding of how to weaponize emptiness. In that lightless shaft, time didn't pass, it dissolved, and with it, so did the will to resist. Doran's didn't just kill people, it erased them twice over, first from society, then from their own minds. If the Oubliette was a forgotten tomb and the Iron Maiden a theatrical nightmare, then the Witch's Cage of Bamberg was something far more insidious, a prison designed not just to punish, but to humiliate. Suspended high above the town square in a wrought iron contraption resembling an oversized birdcage, victims were left exposed to the elements and the jeering crowds below. The caged bars were spaced just wide enough to let hands and feet dangle helplessly, but too narrow to allow any semblance of comfort. Rain soaked their clothes. Sun scorched their skin, and all the while the people of Bamberg went about their days below, tossing insults or rotten food upward like a macabre form of entertainment. What made the Witch's Cage particularly cruel wasn't just the physical torment, it was the psychological annihilation. Most prisoners were women accused of witchcraft, often targeted for little more than being unmarried, outspoken, or simply unfortunate enough to cross paths with a neighbor's superstition. Once confined in the cage, their fate was sealed. The very act of displaying them so publicly turned suspicion into certainty. By the time they were hauled down days or even weeks later, their weakened state and delirious ramblings only proved their guilt to onlookers. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of suffering. The cage design was a masterstroke of calculated terror. Unlike dank dungeons hidden from view, this was punishment as public spectacle. Townsfolk grew accustomed to the sight of emaciated figures swaying above them, their moans blending into the background noise of the marketplace. Children played beneath it. Lovers exchanged whispers nearby. The normalization of such brutality made it all the more effective, a constant reminder of what happened to those who defied societal expectations. But perhaps the darkest irony lay in the cage's legacy. Many of the accused were eventually cleared of witchcraft after their deaths. Their names were posthumously restored, their families given meager compensations. The cage itself, now an artifact in a museum, stands as a chilling testament to how easily fear can twist justice into something monstrous. And in that, it shares a thread with every prison we've explored. The true horror wasn't the iron or the isolation. It was the human capacity to convince itself that such cruelty was necessary. High above the cobbled streets of Bamberg, the Witch's Cage creaked in the wind, its iron bars casting jagged shadows over the town square. This wasn't just a prison, it was a stage for terror, designed to break the accused not only with pain, but with the crushing weight of public shame. Inside, women often elderly, outspoken, or simply unlucky huddled in a space barely large enough to stand, their limbs twisted between the bars like broken branches. Below, townsfolk gathered to gawk, their jeers rising with the stench of rotting food tossed upward. The cage's true horror wasn't in its construction, but in its purpose, to turn fear into spectacle and neighbors into executioners. Sleep deprivation was the jailer's first tool. Prisoners were kept awake for days, their exhaustion blurring the line between reality and nightmare. Then came the device's rusty thumb screws, iron boots heated over coals, racks that stretched joints until tendons snapped like overstrung lute strings. Each instrument had a grim specificity. The witch's chair, studded with spikes, forced victims to balance motionless for hours, lest they impale themselves. The strappado hoisted them by bound wrists, dislocating shoulders with a single tug of the rope. But the most insidious torture was psychological. Guards whispered that confessing would bring mercy, even as they tightened the screws. Families were threatened within earshot, their sobs used as leverage. Confessions, of course, were inevitable. Under such torment, even the innocent would admit to flying on broomsticks or consorting with demons. The real tragedy lay in what followed. A confession didn't end the suffering, it sealed their fate. Trials were mere formalities. The cage had already pronounced judgment. Those who recanted were dragged back to the devices, their defiance punished with renewed agony. Few emerged alive, and those who did bore permanent scars, their bodies as broken as their reputations. Yet the witch's cage legacy isn't just one of cruelty. It's a chilling lesson in how easily systems of justice can become engines of persecution. The trials didn't target criminals, they preyed on the vulnerable. Healers with knowledge of herbs, widows with inconvenient inheritances, women who simply didn't conform. The caged bars were mirrored by the bars of superstition, and together they built a prison no one could escape. Today, its empty silhouette still looms over Bamberg, not as a relic but as a warning. When fear replaces fairness, the real witchcraft is the silence of those who look away. Hidden deep within the walls of a Spanish monastery, the prison of the 7 deadly sins turned medieval theology into a blueprint for psychological warfare. Each cell was meticulously designed to weaponize human weakness, transforming abstract vices into visceral, inescapable torment. Take the Chamber of Gluttony, a grotesque parody of excess where prisoners were strapped to chairs and force-fed through funnel tubes, their stomachs distending until organs ruptured. The message was clear: even sustenance could become torture when stripped of choice. Meanwhile, the sloth cell took the opposite approach. Prisoners were forced onto treadmills that never stopped, their legs pumping endlessly as guards poured cold water on those who faltered. Sleep deprivation melted minds within days, reducing grown men to sobbing wrecks who'd confess to anything just to collapse. But the true horror lay in the prison's psychological precision. The lust cell didn't rely on physical pain, it employed sensory overload, flooding the space with overpowering perfumes and the sounds of muffled laughter, stoking frustration without release. Pride's punishment was even more insidious. Inmates were dressed in rotting finery and paraded before laughing crowds, their dignity peeled away layer by layer. And then there was wrath, where prisoners were locked in pairs, each given a single knife and told the other had been ordered to kill them first. The cell's walls bore the scratch marks of those who'd chosen suicide over suspicion. What set this prison apart wasn't just its cruelty, but its twisted creativity. Medieval torturers typically relied on crude implements: racks, spikes, fire. Here, the tools were far more subtle, the human psyche itself. By tailoring each cell to a specific sin, the jailers didn't just punish the body, they exposed the fragility of the soul. Survivors, though few ever left sane, described the experience as having their own minds turned against them. The prison's genius was its understanding that the deadliest cages aren't made of iron, but of fear, shame, and the unbearable weight of self-awareness. And perhaps that's why this experiment in torment still chills us today. It wasn't medieval, it was prophetic. These cells foreshadowed modern psychological torture techniques, proving that the most effective prisons don't need walls at all. Just the right kind of darkness placed precisely where it can grow. The iron cage of Louis Roman XI wasn't just a prison, it was a monarch's twisted masterpiece, a symbol of power so absolute it turned human suffering into royal propaganda. Commissioned by the cunning French king known as the Spider for his web of intrigues, this contraption redefined cruelty with its chilling simplicity. Picture a coffin-sized enclosure of thick iron bars, its interior studded with spikes just long enough to pierce flesh without delivering a fatal wound. Prisoners were forced inside, their bodies contorted into unnatural positions as the sharp points pressed against their backs, thighs, and shoulders. Every twitch, every involuntary shudder drove the spikes deeper, transforming stillness into the only form of mercy. What set Louis Cage apart was its dual purpose. It wasn't hidden away in some dungeon, but displayed prominently in the Château de Loches as a warning to visiting nobles. The king understood that fear was most potent when it was visible. Victims languished in full view of the court, their muffled groans a backdrop to feasts and diplomacy. The cage design ensured they wouldn't die quickly, prolonging their agony for weeks or even months. One famous inmate, Bishop Balou, survived 2 years in its embrace, emerging with a hunched posture and hollow eyes that silenced even the boldest critics of the crown. But the true horror lay in the cage's psychological torment. Unlike the dank anonymity of the Oubliette or the chaotic brutality of Newgate, this was suffering as performance art. Prisoners became living sculptures of submission, their pain meticulously curated to reinforce the king's dominance. The spikes weren't random, they were placed with surgical precision to avoid vital organs, ensuring maximum endurance. Guards would occasionally rotate the cage, letting gravity redistribute the victim's weight and reopen half-healed wounds. Even the cage location was calculated. Positioned near a window, prisoners endured scorching summers and frostbitten winters, their bodies buffeted by the elements like meat on a hook. Louis' innovation wasn't the iron itself, but the spectacle. His cage turned punishment into theater, and the audience wasn't just the court, it was history itself. Centuries later, the contraption still chills us not because of its spikes, but because of what it revealed, the ease with which power can weaponize visibility. The Spider King didn't just want his enemies broken, he wanted them to serve as a lesson long after their screams faded, and in that, he succeeded beyond measure. The cage's rusted remains still hang in Loches today, a silent testament to how thin the line between ruler and tyrant can become when cruelty wears a crown. Louis XI of France didn't just want his enemies imprisoned, he wanted them transformed into living warnings, their suffering as visible as the crown upon his head. The so-called Spider King wove his web of control with threads of psychological terror, and nowhere was this more evident than in his infamous iron cage. Suspended high within the Château de Loches, this barbaric contraption was less a prison and more a grotesque art piece, its spikes positioned with chilling precision. Victims weren't merely locked inside, they were displayed, their contorted bodies forced into a perpetual embrace with jagged metal. Every shift of weight, every gasp for breath drove the barbs deeper, turning stillness into the only fleeting relief. What set Louis Cage apart wasn't just its brutality, but its theatricality. Unlike dank dungeons hidden from sight, this device occupied a central hall where courtiers and diplomats dined beneath its swaying occupant. The king understood the power of spectacle. The cage wasn't just a tool of punishment, but a performative reminder of his absolute authority. Bishop Balou, once a trusted advisor, endured 2 years within its grasp, his slow deterioration a cautionary tale for any noble considering betrayal. The cage design ensured survival long enough for the message to sink in. Defiance would be met not with swift death, but with excruciating visibility. The true horror lay in the cage's adaptability to its environment. Positioned near a window, prisoners baked under summer sun or shivered through winter frosts, their exposed skin blistering or turning necrotic. Guards would periodically rotate the structure, redistributing the victim's weight to reopen wounds and prevent merciful numbing. Even the spikes were calibrated, long enough to pierce muscle, but too short to puncture vital organs. This wasn't torture born of rage. It was cruelty refined into a science, each element calculated to maximize endurance. Yet the cage's most insidious feature was its legacy. Long after Louis' death, the device remained on display, its rusted bars a silent sermon on the cost of dissent. Modern dictators and despots would later employ similar tactics, not just to break individuals, but to fracture the collective will of those who witnessed their suffering. The Spider King's innovation wasn't the iron itself, but the realization that the most effective prisons aren't those that hide agony, but those that brandish it. And in that, he crafted something far more enduring than metal, a blueprint for tyranny that would echo through the centuries. Warwick Castle's dungeons didn't just imprison bodies, they tortured time itself. Imagine being shackled to a damp stone wall as icy water began pooling around your ankles, rising inch by inch with the relentless precision of a ticking clock. The dungeon's design was diabolical in its simplicity. Built below the waterline of the River Avon, its floors flooded with every high tide, turning the space into a frigid, slow-filling coffin. Prisoners would watch in horror as the water climbed first to their knees, then their waists, then their chests, knowing the next tide would plunge them under entirely unless they could somehow stay upright for days on end. The cold was the first weapon. Even in summer, the river water numbed limbs within minutes, turning feet into blocks of agony. Frostbite claimed toes, then fingers, then whole limbs as circulation failed. Those who collapsed from exhaustion drowned where they fell, their bodies left to bloat in the stagnant water until the next low tide carried them out. But the true genius of Warwick's horror lay in its predictability. Unlike sudden torture sessions or surprise executions, this was suffering stretched thin, a cycle of rising and receding hope as the waters ebbed and flowed. Prisoners could mark time by the groans of the castle's portcullis gates, signaling another surge of water on its way. Yet the dungeon's cruelty extended beyond its walls. Warwick was no isolated fortress, it was a thriving stronghold, its halls bustling with nobles and servants. The prisoners' screams reverberated through the castle's network of hidden passages, a constant soundtrack of suffering for those above. Guards would joke about the drowned choir, their laughter mingling with the distant pleas for mercy. For the nobility, it was a perverse reassurance. Power wasn't just about wealth or titles. It was about who controlled the water and who was left to drown in it. What makes Warwick's dungeons uniquely haunting isn't just the physical torment, but the psychological calculus behind them. Flooding was no accident, it was policy. The castle's architects didn't merely exploit the river's proximity, they weaponized it. Every brick, every channel was placed to maximize suffering without wasting a single drop of effort. In that sense, the dungeon was a perfect metaphor for medieval justice, relentless, impersonal, and as inexorable as the tide itself. Centuries later, the stones still smell of damp rot, a silent testament to the ingenuity of human cruelty. Beneath the picturesque streets of Salzburg, where Mozart's melodies once floated through the air, lay a hidden world of torment carved into the earth itself, the salt mines. These weren't just sources of wealth, they were prisons where the rock itself became an instrument of suffering. Imagine being lowered into a labyrinth of narrow tunnels, the walls glistening with salt crystals that stung every open wound. The air was thick with dust, each breath scraping the lungs like sandpaper, while the darkness swallowed all sense of time. Prisoners toiled with pickaxes under the watchful eyes of guards, their hands bleeding from the corrosive salt, their bodies bent double in passages barely 3 feet high. The mine's cruelty wasn't just in the labor, it was in the slow, creeping destruction of the body. Salt seeped into every cut, turning minor scrapes into festering wounds. Dehydration was constant. The dry air sucked moisture from skin and lips, leaving prisoners delirious with thirst even as brackish water dripped mockingly from the walls above. And then there was the silence. Unlike the echoing screams of castle dungeons, the mines swallowed sound whole. Men would work for hours without speaking, the only noise the rhythmic tap of metal on stone, a grim metronome counting down their lives. But the true horror lay in the mine's indifference. These tunnels had existed for centuries, their walls carved by generations of forced labor. Prisoners weren't just punished, they became part of the machinery, their suffering as routine as the extraction of salt itself. Some were political dissidents, others were simply unlucky peasants who couldn't pay debts or outsiders accused of petty crimes. The mines didn't discriminate. They consumed all equally, turning flesh into another resource to be spent. What made Salzburg's mines uniquely terrifying was their duality. Above ground, the city thrived as a beacon of culture and commerce, its wealth built on the very salt extracted by those condemned below. The same substance that preserved food and lined noble pockets also rotted the lungs of the men who dug it. Even today, the mines stand as a chilling reminder. Progress often has a hidden cost, and sometimes the darkest prisons aren't built to hold people, they're built to erase them. The salt mines of Salzburg hid their cruelty beneath a veneer of productivity. What looked like ordinary mining labor was, in reality, a death sentence disguised as work. Prisoners descended into narrow shafts where the very air they breathed turned against them. Salt dust coated their lungs with each gasp, crystallizing into razor-sharp deposits that turned coughs into bloody spasms. Over weeks, breathing became a torment. Over months, it became impossible. But the mine's true horror lay in their silence. Unlike the clanging chains of dungeons, these tunnels swallowed sound, the only noises being the occasional drip of water or the distant crack of rock. Men died inches apart without ever hearing each other's whimpers. Collapses were as frequent as they were unforgiving. Support beams, hastily erected by exhausted prisoners, would splinter without warning, burying workers under tons of glittering salt. Rescue attempts were rare while waste effort retrieving the condemned when fresh labor arrived daily. Survivors recounted the suffocating weight of rubble, the way salt grains filled mouths and nostrils like a slow avalanche, preserving bodies eerily well in the sterile environment. Some were found years later, their skin leathered but eerily intact, their final expressions frozen in silent screams. Yet the bitterest irony lay in the mine's legacy. Salzburg's wealth, its grand cathedrals, its bustling markets, was built on this very salt. The same substance that seasoned nobles' feasts also pickled the lungs of those who dug it. Prisoners weren't just laborers, they were raw material, their suffering as much a commodity as the crystals they hacked from the earth. Even today, the mines operate as tourist attractions, their history sanitized into folklore. But the walls, remember, scratch at the right spot, and you'll still find the faintest marks, initials, dates, desperate prayers, etched by fingers that knew they'd never see daylight again. What made Salzburg's mines uniquely sinister was their mundanity. This wasn't torture as spectacle, but suffering industrialized. The system didn't need executioners when the salt itself did the killing. And perhaps that's the most chilling lesson. Sometimes the deadliest prisons don't need bars, just darkness, time, and the indifference of those above ground who never had to breathe the dust. At the heart of Donington Castle's ruins lies a pit so cruel it turned hunger into a spectator sport. Unlike ordinary dungeons where starvation crept in silently, the whole of Donington weaponized anticipation. Prisoners were thrown into a cylindrical shaft deeper than two grown men standing shoulder to shoulder, its smooth stone walls offering no purchase for fingers or toes. But the real torment began when the jailers lowered food just enough to smell, just close enough to see, but always dangling inches beyond desperate fingertips. A loaf of bread swaying on a rope became a taunt, a wedge of cheese pulled upward at the last moment, a form of psychological warfare more agonizing than any lash. The pit's design was diabolical in its simplicity. Without stairs or ladders, escape was geometrically impossible. Guards could peer over the edge to watch their captives leap and flail like marionettes with cut strings, their energy wasting away with each failed grasp. Some prisoners reportedly went mad within days, their shrieks echoing up the shaft as they hallucinated banquets above. Others turned on each other, the strongest using the weak as stepping stones in doomed attempts to reach the rim. But the hole's true innovation was its passive brutality. It required no torturer's hand beyond the initial push. Nature did the rest, with gravity and time serving as silent executioners. Historical accounts suggest the pit wasn't reserved for common criminals. During the English Civil War, it held captured officers, men accustomed to honor and dignity, now reduced to scrambling for scraps like animals. The message was clear: rank meant nothing in the dark. What makes Donington's horror linger in the imagination isn't just the physical suffering, but the calculated dismantling of hope. Unlike spikes or racks that offered finality, this was prolonged theater, each lowered meal a reset button on despair. Today, the hole sits filled with rubble, its depths buried under centuries of soil and neglect. But the lesson remains uncomfortably relevant. The cruelest prisons aren't always those that inflict pain directly. Sometimes they're the ones that make you complicit in your own torment, dangling survival just close enough to taste, but never to hold. Rising from the tidal waters of Normandy like a stone sentinel, Mont-Saint-Michel's Abbey hides a secret beneath its soaring Gothic arches. A maze of cells where prisoners weren't just locked away, but shackled to the very walls that confined them. These weren't ordinary chains, they were calibrated instruments of torment, their lengths precisely measured to allow just enough movement to prevent muscle atrophy from immobilization, but never enough to sit, lie down, or find respite. Picture a space no wider than a coffin, the prisoner's wrists bound to opposite walls in a permanent crucifixion pose, their body suspended in agonizing tension. The genius, if one can call it, that was in the physics. Too much slack and the victim might rest, too little and death would come too quickly. Instead, the chains kept prisoners in a hellish equilibrium, where every shift of weight sent fresh bolts of pain through dislocated shoulders. What made Mont-Saint-Michel's cells uniquely sinister was their sacred backdrop. While other dungeons reveled in their grimness, these chambers lay within a working monastery, their occupants forced to listen to the echoing chants of monks praising God just floors above. The contrast was excruciating: divine grace overhead, damnation below. Some prisoners reportedly begged for the Oubliette's silence over this torment, where the hymns became taunts, a reminder of salvation forever out of reach. The cell's locations also weaponized the tides. During storms, seawater would seep through the lower chambers, turning them into briny traps where prisoners hung like macabre puppets, their legs submerged for hours in icy water that gnawed at flesh and bone. But the true horror lay in the chain's psychological precision. Unlike spikes or racks that broke the body quickly, this was a slow unraveling of the mind. Without the ability to touch one's own face or even curl into a fetal position, prisoners lost the most basic comforts of self. Survivors, those few released as warnings, described hallucinating that their limbs had fused with the iron, their sense of identity eroding alongside their muscles. The Abbey's records speak of men who'd forgotten their own names after a year in the darkness, their voices reduced to animalistic whimpers. Mont-Saint-Michel's legacy as both sanctuary and prison reveals a dark duality. The same hands that carved altars and illuminated manuscripts also forged these shackles, proving that cruelty needs no barbaric tools. Sometimes all it takes is cold calculation and the unwavering belief that some souls deserve neither mercy nor movement. The chains are gone now, but the walls still whisper. Lean close enough and you might hear the ghostly rattle of iron against stone, a sound that outlasted even the prayers. High above the Normandy coast, where Mont-Saint-Michel's spires seem to pierce the heavens, lies a hidden contradiction, a place of worship built atop a chamber of horrors. The abbey's chained cells weren't just prisons. They were experiments in the art of stillness, where shackles transformed human beings into living statues. Picture iron rings bolted directly into the granite, their rough edges biting into wrists already raw from weeks of struggle. The chains themselves were masterpieces of misery, just long enough to permit a half-step forward, teasing the illusion of movement, but never enough to sit or lie down. Prisoners spent months suspended in perpetual tension, their muscles locked in a battle between exhaustion and pain, their bodies becoming maps of cramping agony. But the true genius of these cells lay in their synchronization with the sea. Mont-Saint-Michel wasn't merely an island, it was a tidal fortress surrounded by waters that rose with terrifying speed. During storms, waves would crash against the lower cell walls, salt water seeping through cracks in the medieval masonry. Those chained closest to the floor faced a ghastly choice: stand on tiptoe for hours as the icy tide swirled around their thighs, or surrender to the rising flood and let the sea claim them. Survivors described the nightmare of feeling the water climb inch by inch, their ankles burning with cold, their leg muscles trembling uncontrollably until collapse seemed inevitable. Some tried to hook their chains over protruding stones, desperate to elevate themselves even slightly. Others succumbed to the numbing embrace of hypothermia, their final moments marked by eerie calm as the water closed over their heads. What set these cells apart wasn't just their brutality, but their spiritual cruelty. This was a working monastery, its halls echoing with Gregorian chants and the scent of incense. Prisoners could hear the resonant boom of the abbey's great organ during Mass, the joyous hymns twisting into cruel mockery as they hung in their private hells. The contrast between divine light and earthly suffering became its own form of torture. Records tell of one prisoner who began reciting scripture backward in his delirium, his voice rising to a shriek until the guards gagged him with his own tunic. Yet perhaps the most chilling detail was the chain's legacy. Unlike other medieval torture devices that relied on spikes or flames, these restraints left no visible scars. Victims who survived emerged with their skin intact, but their minds fractured, haunted by phantom sensations of restraint, jerking awake at night, convinced their wrists were still bound. The monks called it the ghost iron, a phenomenon where the body remembers what the soul longs to forget. Today, when tourists marvel at Mont-Saint-Michel's beauty, few realize that the same hands that carved its soaring arches also forged those shackles. The abbey stands as a monument to humanity's dual capacity for creation and cruelty, its stones whispering a question that lingers like the tide: how thin is the line between holiness and horror? The prison of the rats turned one of humanity's oldest fears into a method of execution so slow, so intimate, it redefined cruelty. Picture being strapped to a wooden plank, your limbs bound with coarse ropes, as the flickering torchlight revealed shadows moving along the floor. At first, just a rustling, then the squeaks, then the first tentative nibble at your toes, exploratory, almost curious. By the time the rats realized you couldn't fight back, the real horror began. These weren't wild scavengers, they were starved for days beforehand, their desperation sharpened into a predatory focus. Jailers would sometimes smear the prisoner's skin with food scraps or honey, turning the body into a living lure. The rodents didn't just bite, they burrowed, their tiny claws and teeth working methodically through flesh, drawn deeper by the scent of blood and the warmth of exposed muscle. What made this torture uniquely grotesque wasn't just the physical agony, but the psychological torment of helpless observation. Victims couldn't thrash or swat. They could only lie there as creatures no larger than a fist reduced them piece by piece. Some accounts describe rats gnawing through soft tissue, first the eyelids, the lips leaving prisoners blind and mute but still agonizingly conscious. Others tell of the animals tunneling into the abdomen, their bodies squirming beneath the skin as they feasted on organs still pulsing with life. The process could take days, the line between life and death blurred by each excruciating nibble. Yet the true genius, if such a word can be used, lay in the spectacle. Unlike hidden oubliettes or solitary iron cages, rat torture was often performed in semi-public spaces, the prisoners' screams serving as a warning to others. In some European castles, dungeons were built with grated floors, allowing onlookers to watch from above as the rodents swarmed below. The message was clear: defiance would reduce you to nothing more than sustenance for vermin. Even the rats themselves became symbols of the state's power, turned from pests into executioners with a flick of a jailer's hand. Perhaps the most chilling detail, though, was the aftermath. Survivors, those rescued at the last moment, rarely died from their wounds. Instead, they succumbed to infections or madness, their minds unraveled by the memory of tiny teeth in the dark. The rats, meanwhile, returned to their cages, ready to be starved again for the next prisoner. In that way, the system perpetuated itself, a cycle of cruelty as efficient as it was inhuman. Centuries later, the method's legacy lingers not in instruments or artifacts, but in our collective dread, the primal fear of being eaten alive, weaponized by those who understood that sometimes the most effective tortures come on small, scurrying feet. High above the bustling streets of medieval Lübeck, where traders haggled over spices and children chased each other through cobbled alleys, the hanging cages swung silently in the wind, a grim counterpoint to the city's prosperity. These iron contraptions, suspended from gibbets along the city walls, weren't just instruments of execution, they were lessons in slow-motion mortality. Prisoners, often pirates or political rebels, were locked inside these human-sized birdcage, their bodies contorted to fit the cramped metal frames, left to endure the elements with no shelter from sun, rain, or the biting Baltic winds. The cage's design was a masterstroke of psychological terror, elevated high enough for all to see, yet just low enough that the dying could still hear the sounds of life continuing below. Laughter, church bells, the clatter of carts, each a cruel reminder of the world moving on without them. What made Lübeck's cages uniquely harrowing was their prolonged timeline of suffering. Unlike gallows that delivered a swift end, these devices stretched death into weeks or even months. Starvation and dehydration were inevitable, but the real torment came from exposure. Summer sun turned the metal into a griddle, searing skin where it touched the bars. Winter frost glued flesh to iron, leaving prisoners to wonder whether pulling away would tear their skin or freeze them in place. Birds pecked at exposed fingers. Rain flooded the cage's floors, forcing inmates to stand in icy water until their legs gave out. And always there was the swaying, the relentless rocking with every gust of wind, a nausea-inducing pendulum that denied even the comfort of stillness. Yet the cage's true power lay in their visibility. Lübeck was a wealthy trading hub, its prosperity built on order. The cages served as a civic billboard: cross the law, and this would be your fate, your suffering displayed like merchandise in a shop window. Families passing below might point upward, parents using the withering figures as morality tales for their children. The condemned became part of the city's rhythm, background noise to daily life, as mundane as the tolling of the cathedral clock. Some prisoners reportedly begged for executioners to cut their throats, but the law refused. The cages weren't just about justice, they were about spectacle, the slow erosion of a human being into a cautionary silhouette. By the time death finally came, it was almost an afterthought, a relief to both the prisoner and the onlookers who'd grown accustomed to their presence. The cages would be lowered, the bones disposed of, and the iron scrubbed clean, ready for the next occupant. Today, replicas still hang in Lübeck's museum, their polished bars gleaming under soft lights, a sanitized echo of a time when justice wasn't just served, it was displayed hour after hour until the last breath rattled free. The hanging cages of Lübeck didn't just punish criminals, they turned human suffering into a public monument, a grotesque art installation that loomed over the city for years. Imagine being hoisted into one of these iron contraptions, your limbs forced through the bars like a rag doll stuffed into a birdcage, the metal biting into your flesh with every gust of wind. There was no quick drop, no merciful snap of the neck, just the slow, inexorable grind of time and the elements, each day stretching into an eternity of thirst, starvation, and the relentless ache of muscles locked in perpetual strain. What made Lübeck's cages especially horrifying was their longevity. While other execution methods delivered finality, these devices were designed for lingering. Some prisoners lasted weeks, their bodies withering under the sun like fruit left to dry. Others clung to life for months, their skeletal frames gradually becoming part of the city's skyline, a macabre weather vane that creaked with every storm. The cages weren't just about death, they were about transformation, reducing a living, breathing person into a cautionary silhouette, their bones rattling in the wind long after their last breath. And then there was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. Unlike the raucous crowds that gathered at gallows, Lübeck's cages operated in eerie quiet. The condemned would scream, of course, in those first days, but as dehydration set in, their voices faded to hoarse whispers, then to nothing at all. Passers-by grew accustomed to the sight, barely glancing upward as they went about their daily lives. The cages became part of the urban fabric, as mundane as the tolling of the cathedral bell. Children played beneath them, lovers stole kisses in their shadows. The message was clear: justice here wasn't an event, it was a backdrop, a constant reminder that defiance would leave you dangling between heaven and earth, forgotten by both. Yet the cage's true brilliance, if such a word can be used, lay in their adaptability. In winter, frost transformed them into glittering tombs, prisoners' breath freezing on the bars like ghostly lace. Summer turned the metal scorching hot, branding flesh with gridiron patterns. Rain flooded the floors, forcing inmates to stand in icy water until their legs gave out. The cages didn't just kill, they collaborated with nature, each season offering new torments. But perhaps the most unsettling detail was the cleanup. When death finally came, the cages weren't dismantled. They were scrubbed, their hinges oiled, their bars polished, ready for the next occupant, the bones. Sometimes left inside as a grisly garnish, other times tossed unceremoniously into mass graves. The system never paused, it just reset like a clockwork horror that never needed winding. Today, replicas hang in museums, their rust cleaned away, their history sanitized. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of the wind whistling through those iron ribs, a sound that once spelled the end of hope. Deep beneath the Château de Loches, the Oubliettes weren't just holes in the ground, they were masterclasses in architectural cruelty. Unlike traditional vertical pits where prisoners might brace against parallel walls, these French horrors featured smooth, inward-sloping sides that defied all attempts to climb. Imagine being thrown into darkness, your feet scrambling for purchase as gravity pulled you inexorably toward the center, where the floor dipped into a shallow depression. Every movement, every desperate claw at the slick limestone only dragged you deeper. The genius of this design was its diabolical simplicity. No spikes, no chains, just pure, unassailable physics turning the human body against itself. What made Loch's Oubliettes uniquely terrifying was their silent efficiency. While other dungeons relied on guards or devices to maintain control, these pits needed no supervision. Once a prisoner slid into the central bowl, escape became geometrically impossible. The slope was just gradual enough to prevent standing upright, yet steep enough to foil any attempt to crawl out. Survivors, though few ever emerged, described the horror of feeling their muscles atrophy over weeks, their bodies curling involuntarily toward the pit's lowest point like human hourglasses, each twitch measuring the passage of time. But the true nightmare lay in the Oubliette's secondary function, waste disposal. The central depression wasn't merely a design quirk, it collected filth. Rainwater seeped through cracks in the castle's foundations, mixing with excrement and the occasional corpse to form a putrid slurry. Prisoners who didn't starve first often succumbed to infections, their open sores festering in the bacteria-rich muck. The stench clung to skin and hair long after death, a final indignity that outlasted even the victims themselves. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect was the psychological calculus behind these pits. Their name, Oubliette, from the French oublier, meaning to forget, wasn't metaphorical. These weren't places of punishment so much as erasure. Unlike public executions or hanging cages meant to deter others, Oubliettes operated in absolute secrecy. No crowds gathered to witness the suffering, no records noted the prisoner's final words, just the mute certainty of being swallowed by stone, your very existence wiped clean from memory. Loch's enduring lesson isn't about medieval barbarism, it's about the banality of evil. These pits required no specialized torturers or complex mechanisms. Just a slope, a dip in the floor, a quiet corner of a castle where screams couldn't escape. In that sense, they were the perfect prison, self-sustaining, self-cleaning, and utterly, chillingly indifferent. Centuries later, tourists peer into these voids, their flashlight beams revealing grooves worn into the stone, not from tools but from fingernails. 1,000 forgotten souls, all trying in vain to climb the same impossible curve. While the Tower of London's outer walls held the infamous Little Ease and the Rack, its most carefully guarded horror lay concealed behind an unremarkable wooden door, the Bloody Tower's secret chamber. This wasn't just another cell, it was a carefully engineered void where geometry itself became a tormentor. The room's dimensions were calculated to the inch, too narrow to lie down, too short to stand upright, the ceiling sloping just enough to prevent comfortable leaning. Prisoners entered to the sound of the door's triple locking mechanism, a series of iron bolts sliding home with the finality of a coffin lid sealing shut. Then came the darkness, so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against the eyes. What set this chamber apart was its acoustic torture. The walls, lined with a thin layer of lead, created a phenomenon called the whispering room. Any sound made inside reverberated for minutes, morphing coughs into thunderclaps and whimpers into ghostly wails. Guards reported hearing prisoners beg for mercy from voices that weren't there, their own pleas twisted into taunting echoes. The chamber's most infamous victim, Sir Walter Raleigh, described it as being buried alive with one's own madness. His normally eloquent letters reduced to fragmented ramblings after just 3 nights within its walls. Yet the true horror lay in the chamber's dual purpose. By day, it served as an interrogation room, its disorienting effects loosening tongues faster than any rack. By night, it transformed into a psychological grinder, the lack of sensory input causing hallucinations so vivid that prisoners would scratch at their faces to remove invisible spiders or scream about non-existent fires. The genius, if such a word fits, was in its adaptability. Political dissidents like Raleigh faced the Whispering Room's auditory assaults, while religious heretics were subjected to a variation called the Silent Sister, where felt-lined walls swallowed every sound, leaving victims trapped in a vacuum of their own heartbeat. The chamber's legacy endures not in instruments or blueprints. Few records survive, but in the accounts of those who emerged broken. One Spanish ambassador, permitted to visit a condemned nobleman in 1587, described finding the man meticulously plucking hairs from his arm, convinced each strand was a burning fuse. Another prisoner, released after 2 weeks, spent his remaining days perpetually turning in circles, his equilibrium so shattered he could no longer walk straight. What makes the Bloody Tower's secret chamber uniquely chilling isn't its physical brutality, but its understanding of the mind's fragility. Unlike Iron Maidens or hanging cages, this was torture refined to an almost clinical precision, a blueprint for unraveling a person without leaving a single visible mark. The walls still stand today, their ordinary appearance belying the horrors they once contained. Run your hand along the stones and you might feel the faintest vibration, not from the past but from the present. The tower's ravens, those keepers of legend, sometimes roost in the chamber's hidden alcoves. Their echoing cause a haunting reminder that some prisons don't need bars. Just 4 walls, a door that locks from the outside, and the infinite darkness of a mind turning against itself. The Bloody Tower's secret chamber wasn't just a room, it was a carefully crafted void where the very walls conspired against sanity. Hidden behind an unmarked door in the tower of London's labyrinthine depths, this space defied the crude brutality of spikes and chains. Instead, its architects weaponized emptiness, designing a cell so devoid of sensory input that the mind turned inward, devouring itself. Prisoners who crossed its threshold described an instant disorientation, as if stepping into a space where time and dimension unraveled. The walls, lined with thick layers of felt, swallowed every sound, transforming coughs into silent gestures and screams into mute vibrations. Without light, without echo, even the act of breathing became an eerie, isolated performance. What set this chamber apart was its precision. Unlike the Oubliette's crude pit or the Iron Maiden's theatrical spikes, this was torture refined to a science. The room's dimensions, exactly 7 paces long, 4 paces wide, were calculated to deny the body any natural rhythm. Too small to walk comfortably, too large to touch opposing walls simultaneously, it left prisoners suspended in a purgatory of unfinished motion. Some paced until their feet blistered, their minds tricked into believing hours had passed when mere minutes had crawled by. Others curled into corners, only to find the silence pressing louder than any dungeon's roar. The chamber's most infamous victim, the Duke of Northumberland, reportedly chewed through his own wrist in a delirium, convinced his veins housed slithering eels. Yet the true horror lay in the chamber's ambiguity. No official records confirmed its existence, and guards spoke of it only in coded whispers. Prisoners brought there were blindfolded through winding passages, disoriented until the door sealed behind them. Some were left for days with a single jug of brackish water, their rations doled out at irregular intervals to disrupt any semblance of routine. Others faced the opposite torment, a ceaseless drip from an unseen source, each drop calibrated to fall just beyond predictable rhythm until the sound colonized their dreams. The chamber's legacy endures in the gaps of history. Unlike the tower's more visible instruments of pain, this room left no physical marks. Its victims emerged hollow-eyed and trembling, their stories fragmented by trauma. One account tells of a French spy who, after 3 nights inside, could no longer recognize his own reflection, screaming that his face had been stolen by the dark. Another describes a nobleman who spent his final years tracing invisible patterns on tabletops, his fingers forever restless from the memory of walls he couldn't touch. Perhaps the most chilling detail is the chamber's modern echo. Sensory deprivation tanks and isolation cells still draw from its blueprint, proving that the deadliest prisons aren't always built of stone. Sometimes they're crafted from nothing more than silence and space, a lesson the tower's architects understood all too well. Today, tourists walk unknowingly past the likely site, their footsteps muffled by carpets laid over ancient floorboards. But beneath them, the darkness remembers, and so do the ravens, those black-cloaked sentinels, who sometimes pause mid-caw near a particular wall, as if listening for whispers that never quite faded. In the heart of Berg Eltz, a medieval castle nestled in the German hills, there existed a dungeon where the very act of breathing too loudly could be a death sentence. This was the Dungeon of Silence, a place where sound itself was treated as contraband, and the punishment for breaking this rule was as swift as it was final. Guards patrolled the corridors in felt-soled shoes, their footsteps absorbed by the thick wool, turning every hallway into an eerie soundscape of nothingness. Prisoners quickly learned that even a whisper could bring the executioner's blade down before their next breath. The dungeon's design amplified this terror. Walls lined with layers of straw and fabric swallowed every cough, every whimper, leaving inmates trapped in a vacuum where their own heartbeat became the loudest noise. The psychological toll was immediate and brutal. Without the ability to speak, prisoners lost their sense of time, their grip on reality fraying as days blurred into weeks. Some began mouthing words silently, their lips forming pleas that would never be heard. Others resorted to tapping rhythms on the walls, only to be discovered by guards who appeared like ghosts, materializing without warning to deliver punishment. The worst part, the silence wasn't just enforced, it was weaponized. Guards would occasionally mimic distant voices or scrape metal against stone just beyond the cell doors, tricking prisoners into calling out in hope, only to seal their fate with a single, fatal sound. But the true horror of the Dungeon of Silence wasn't just the executions, it was the way it turned isolation into something far more sinister. In other prisons, inmates might find solace in shared suffering, bonding through whispers or songs. Here, even eye contact was dangerous. A glance could be misinterpreted as an attempt to communicate, a stifled sob as an act of defiance. The dungeon's architects understood something primal. Humans are wired for connection, and to strip that away is to unravel the mind itself. Survivors, those rare few who were released as warnings, described emerging with voices that had atrophied from disuse, their first words often little more than hoarse croaks. What makes this dungeon stand out among medieval horrors is its chilling modernity. Long before sensory deprivation was studied as a torture technique, the Dungeon of Silence had perfected it. Even today, its legacy lingers in the way we understand the power of sound or its absence. The next time you find yourself in a quiet room, pause for a moment. Listen to the hum of the world around you. Then imagine that silence stretching on forever, broken only by the knowledge that speaking up could cost you everything. That's the real terror of the Dungeon of Silence. It wasn't just a prison. It was a living experiment in how much a person can endure before they break. And the results were as predictable as they were devastating. High in the mist-shrouded Carpathian Mountains, where the legends of Dracula whisper through the stone corridors of Bran Castle, lies a horror that eclipses even the bloodiest vampire tales, the grave cells. These weren't just dungeons, they were tombs for the living, spaces so narrow that prisoners couldn't sit, lie down, or even fully extend their arms. Imagine being sealed upright in a slit of stone, your chest pressed against the icy wall, your back scraping against jagged rock as the air grew thick with the stench of your own breath. The cell's dimensions weren't just cramped, they were calculated to mimic the confines of a coffin, forcing inmates to confront their own burial long before death took them. What set these cells apart was their psychological precision. Unlike other medieval prisons that relied on physical torment, Bran Castle's grave cells weaponized claustrophobia. The walls were carved just wide enough to prevent suffocation but narrow enough to erase any sense of space. Prisoners reported hallucinating within hours, their minds conjuring phantom pressures, the weight of the mountain itself seeming to press inward. Some clawed at the rock until their fingers splintered, desperate to widen their prison by millimeters. Others simply shut down, their bodies folding into the tight space like human origami, their whispers fading into the stone. But the true horror lay in the cell's proximity to the castle's chapel. Just a few feet above, priests conducted mass, their hymns drifting down through cracks in the floor like cruel taunts. Prisoners could hear the murmur of prayers, the ringing of bells, sounds of salvation happening literally over their heads. The contrast was excruciating, God's grace above, God-forsaken suffering below. One account tells of a nobleman who, after 3 days in the grave cell, began reciting the Lord's Prayer backward, his voice rising to a shriek as his mind unraveled in the dark. The grave cell's legacy endures not just in their brutality, but in their symbolism. Bran Castle was a border fortress, a bastion against invasion, and these cells embodied that mentality. Enemies weren't just defeated, they were erased, their existence negated by stone. Unlike the Iron Maiden's theatrical spikes or the hanging cage's public spectacle, this was suffering stripped to its essence, a living death, silent and invisible. Today, tourists walk these halls drawn by Dracula's myth, but the real monsters weren't vampires. They were the architects of these cells, men who understood that the most effective prisons aren't built to break bones. They are built to collapse minds. Bran Castle's grave cells redefined claustrophobia as a form of torture, vertical tombs where prisoners were entombed alive, their bodies pressed between stone slabs with less room than a standing coffin. Unlike traditional dungeons where inmates could pace or collapse, these spaces allowed no such relief. The cells measured precisely 22 inches wide enough for a man to inhale, but not enough to raise his elbows or bend his knees. Air slithered in through finger-width holes near the ceiling, not for mercy, but to prolong the agony. Victims didn't suffocate quickly. They marinated in their own terror, their screams absorbed by the thick rock until their voices cracked into silence. What made these cells uniquely horrifying wasn't just the physical confinement, but the psychological theater surrounding them. Guards would often whisper to prisoners that the holes weren't for air, they were for vermin. Rats, drawn by the scent of sweat and fear, would sometimes wriggle through, their claws skittering over trapped limbs in the darkness. The mind's reaction was predictable. Muscles would spasm involuntarily, pressing harder against the unyielding stone, amplifying the illusion of being crushed alive. Some prisoners reportedly chewed their own tunics to stuff into the gaps, desperate to barricade themselves against imagined swarms, yet the true cruelty lay in the acoustics. Bran Castle's chapel sat directly above the grave cells, its floor carved with thin channels that funneled sound downward. Prisoners could hear every hymn, every prayer, every joyous wedding procession, a sonic taunt that twisted faith into torture. One account describes a Wallachian rebel who, after days in the dark, began reciting the Latin Mass alongside the priests above, his voice rising to a delirious crescendo until guards sealed the air holes in punishment. The chapel's stained glass, glowing with sunlight, cast faint colored patterns on the cell's ceiling, close enough to see, but forever out of reach. The cell's legacy extends beyond their physical horrors. They embodied a chilling efficiency, no need for executioners or expensive devices. The mountain itself became the torturer, its immutable weight a metaphor for the state's power. Modern visitors to Bran Castle often pass right over the cells, their attention captured by Dracula folklore. But the real horror isn't supernatural, it's the quiet understanding that these tombs required no vampires to fill them. Just human ingenuity turned inward like a blade. The stones still smell of damp iron, and if you press your palm against them, you might feel the ghostly vibration of a heartbeat, not from the past, but from your own pulse, quickening at the thought of being sealed away forever. These 28 medieval prisons stand as monuments to humanity's darkest creativity, each one proof that when it comes to cruelty, imagination knows no limits. From the slow-motion drowning chambers of Warwick Castle to the whispering walls of the Bloody Tower, these weren't just places of punishment. They were laboratories of suffering, where architects and jailers collaborated to break bodies and shatter minds with chilling precision. What's most unsettling isn't the medieval technology, it's how many of these methods foreshadowed modern psychological torture, the Oubliettes sensory deprivation. A blueprint for solitary confinement, the hanging cage's public humiliation, early propaganda theater. Even the grave cell's claustrophobic terror finds echoes in today's interrogation techniques. But here's the paradox, these prisons also reveal astonishing resilience. Consider the prisoner who etched poetry into the walls of Château, or the heretics in the Salzburg mines who scratched symbols of hope into salt crystals. For every invention designed to erase humanity, there's a story of someone who refused to be unmade. That tension between the ingenuity of cruelty and the stubbornness of the human spirit is why these places still haunt us. They force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The line between civilization and savagery is thinner than a dungeon's wall. So which prison lingers in your mind? The Iron Maiden's theatrical spikes, or the Posse's silent, rising tides? The calculated despair of Doran's vertical shaft, or the grotesque spectacle of the witch's cage? Let's keep the conversation alive. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've made it this far into history's shadows with us, hit that subscribe button. Because the past isn't just about dates and dust, it's a mirror, and sometimes the reflection is harder to face than any dungeon.